Stay cool and choose from over 40 in-stock ceiling fans for under $100, plus an 11% rebate at Menards. We carry the largest selection of in-stock Hunter ceiling fans, available in a variety of designs, finishes, and features. Create the perfect look and lighting for any room with a new Hunter ceiling fan. Visit Menards.com and view our entire selection of Hunter ceiling fans, plus the weekly flyer and other great deals going on now.
Save big money at Menards.
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by Codify, a California benefit corporation. Visit Codify at www.codifi.com.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology.
Welcome to Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 67. I'm your host, Sarah Head, with my co-hosts today, Ken Fader and Jeb Card. And today we have special guest, Professor Ingrid Rowland from the University of Notre Dame in Rome. Professor Rowland writes and lectures on classical antiquity, the Renaissance, and the Age of Baroque. She is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, and she's the author of several books, including the one she's here to talk to us about today, The Scarith of Scornello, A Tale of Renaissance Forgery. Ready to think critically?
No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. My name is Sarah, and I'm here today with my co-host Ken Fader. Ken, how's it going?
It's going snowy, Sarah. We're under about 20 inches of snow, and it's too cold and too windy. But it's, as we were talking before, I'm waiting for all the people to show up on the internet saying, "What's this nonsense about global warming? Look at how much it's snowing in New England."
And I've also got Jeb Card with me tonight.
Hello.
Jeb, how's it going?
Weather-wise, we are living in a wind tunnel, but it's nowhere near as cold, and there's no snow. So I guess
we don't have any snow here either.
Can't complain.
And
we had a power outage yesterday morning because of the wind, though, so that happened.
Oh, all right. Well, that sucks. And today, all the way from Rome, where she has much better weather than the rest of us, we have Ingrid Rowland with us. Hi, Ingrid. How's it going?
It's going well. Weather is, we think, not so good, but it looks pretty good compared with what you...
Yes. I asked Ingrid beforehand not to tell us what the temperature was in Rome today, because it would just hurt my feelings. So we won't go there.
The terrible burdens of a Mediterranean climate.
Yeah, there you go. Now, Ingrid, you are at it's a branch of Notre Dame University?
That's it.
So what's the background here? I mean, how long has Notre Dame had a campus in Rome, and how many students do you have?
See, Notre Dame as a university's had a campus now for 2.5 years, and we probably have about 100 students now, but we have tentacles out in all kinds of places. The School of Architecture's had a program in Rome for almost 50 years. And so what happened is that the entire university decided to follow on the School of Architecture, and we got a new building near the Colosseum, and it's suddenly become palatial.
Wow, huh? Now, are most of your students Notre Dame students who are spending a year abroad, or is it just international?
They're all Notre Dame students, which means de facto they're pretty international.
Oh, okay.
So it used to be that they were Midwestern students who would come open mouth, but now it's really much more cosmopolitan.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
we have a campus in Luxembourg that has a somewhat similar sort of program.
Yes, I tell you here, I'm at Central Connecticut State University, which is located in New Britain, Connecticut, and we have a campus in downtown New Britain. So I can feel you guys. I know what you guys are talking about. Now, the topic today is going to be this fascinating example of a 17th century archaeological fraud, which I had never heard of until about 2006, 2007, when the Journal of Modern History asked me if I would review this new book by Ingrid Rowland called The Scarith of Scornello. I pretended like I knew what that was about, but I'd never heard of it, didn't know what it was about. But the dirty little secret when you agree to do a book review is you get a free copy of the book. So I thought, well, that's cool. I'll get a free copy of the book, and I'll read through it, and I'll do my best to review it. And I have to tell you, I opened it up and I started reading it, and it was just a page turner. I couldn't put it down. It was this fascinating story. And as somebody interested in archaeological fraud and fakery, but whose knowledge focuses on stuff here in North America. So I knew about the Newark Coley stones and the Michigan relics and the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. These are some of the things that we have actually talked about in various shows on the podcast. And the thing that struck me was, even though this is Italy and even though this is the 17th century, I'm seeing common threads, things that I'm seeing in all of these frauds perpetrated here in North America in the 19th century. So when we're talking about ideas for shows, I said we've got to do one on the Scarith of Scornello. And if we're going to do it, let's get the author, let's get the expert on this topic to participate. So thank you very, very much, Ingrid, for agreeing. And now, basically, we're going to sit back and we'll pepper you with questions, but probably most people listening to the podcast have never even heard of this. So give us the background. What is a Scarith? Where is Scornello? And what happened?
And the marketing department of the University of Chicago Press kept saying you can't call it the Scarith of Scornello because nobody will know what those words mean. And
Right.
Scarith means a fake Etruscan capsule invented by a forger. He made up the word to describe the object.
Nice.
Well, if you're going to make up a fake, you might as well make up the word to describe the fake, right?
No, just tell your marketing department it's something from Harry Potter. They'll love it.
Ah, missed out on that one.
One said, "Oh, I didn't know you were doing fiction now."
So
it isn't. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So a Scarith isn't a real thing. It's a real fake thing.
You got it.
Real fake thing. There were some, and they were stolen in about 1985. So that the descendants of the forger kept some, and I met people in the town of Volterra that actually saw them, but the actual objects were stolen after they fixed the roof in their palazzo. And probably were on the market as real antiquities.
Well, yeah, which is awesome. I love when that happens. So, but none of them exists anymore.
Not to anyone's knowledge, and I keep looking on eBay to see.
Yeah, well, we've done a show. We've done the show on the Moose stones or the Niven stones that I've been able to dig a few up.
The Grave Creek tablet in West Virginia that had these bizarre markings that have been translated 20 different ways. That original tablet found in like 1838, that's gone too.
Nobody really? I did not actually know that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's on display. There's a museum where there is a copy on display, and in fact, if you look at photographs of them, most of them are photographs of the copies.
Yeah.
There's like maybe one photograph that Smithsonian scientists took of the original, but the rest, everything else are copies. But so Ingrid, so these are these capsules, and what's inside the capsule?
Paper documents that were rolled up, and we know that they existed because in the 18th century, somebody looked at one of the texts and found the watermark of the local paper factory.
Nice.
If you're going to pull off a fake, you got to put a little more thought into it than using the paper from the local paper manufacturer.
Now, the brilliant thing about all of this is the fact that this kid got away with it. And I came across the whole issue because I was going to write a history of Etruscan studies in the Italian Renaissance. And so I was in the Vatican Library looking in the old card catalog under Etruscans. Mm-hmm. And I found this thing that said Etruscan Antiquities from 1637. And so I pulled up the book and I thought, these are really bogus. And it was obvious that these Etruscan objects were fake. And so I put the book back, and then I thought, that's really stupid. And what I should do is say, why did somebody think this was worth publishing? So I went back and started looking at the forgery, and the whole story of unraveling the mystery was my growing regard for the forger.
Isn't that a very cool feeling when, these things that should only exist in fiction? And I don't mean the actual objects, but the whole story, like they seem to just kind of pop out of the woodwork sometimes.
And this kid turned out to be absolutely brilliant. And not as an archaeologist as much as a humorist. I think he was really a conceptual artist before his time.
Who was this kid you keep referring to?
His name was Curzio Ingirami. He came from a noble family of Volterra, which is the most remote of the Etruscan cities of Italy. The Etruscans were people...
Yeah, go ahead. That's what I was going to ask. If you could kind of tell our listeners what exactly that means.
Yeah, between, say, the end of the Bronze Age, so we're talking about 1200 BC, up until Roman times, between the river Tiber, which is what Rome's on, and the river Arno between Pisa and Florence, all that territory that's mostly what we now call Tuscany was inhabited by people who spoke a language totally different from any of the languages in Italy and any of the languages around them.
It is Indo-European, though?
No, it's not. That's the real interesting thing. So that it's possibly a Finno-Ugric language. It's possibly related to some of the languages in Asia Minor, but it's definitely not Indo-European.
Interesting.
And so you get really amazing words.
And I know there are a lot of like funerary monuments with inscriptions, and there's a whole element that we can read some of it structurally, but we can't. What is our best, like, what is the sort of the rough evidence for Etruscan language? Like what exists?
Yeah, basically what exists are tomb inscriptions. There's some dedications on statues. There's a boundary marker. Actually, there are about 3 or 4 boundary markers. There's a property settlement, and then there's one book, and they wrote on bolts of linen cloth.
Oh, wow.
The book ended up wrapping a mummy on an island off Egypt.
Oh, wow.
The mummy was bought by a Croatian tourist in the 19th century, and then he wanted to see what the mummy looked like, and they realized it was...
I've heard of this. I've heard of that.
So the Zagreb mummy wrap is Our Best Hope is a book, and what it looks like is a sacrificial calendar for the spring months.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And it's an alphabetic script, right?
It's an alphabetic script, so it's taken from the Phoenicians. I actually used Etruscan when I was learning Hebrew because you could crib the Hebrew letters off the Etruscan letters. And it's in the same order as Hebrew and Phoenician and basically Greek and the Roman alphabet.
Okay.
So Ingirami used that script to fabricate these scrolls?
Well, the interesting thing is that he didn't really quite use it.
Oh.
What he has looks more like runes, and I suspect that his father may have had a copy of Olav Orm's book on runes.
Yeah.
And so it's not even, he wrote it left to right in bogus Etruscan.
So,
now,
okay, no, wait.
Go ahead, Sarah.
So there's nothing actually about these artifacts that is authentic in any way, shape, or form?
The interesting thing that I finally realized after I worked on this is that he buried them on a place that probably is a real Etruscan site. And one of the things he found is a genuine Iron Age Etruscan safety pin, so that some of his assemblage was genuine. And the weird thing is that Scornello is in a remote area outside Volterra, which is already remote. And when I finally got to Scornello, I just took a look at this hill and realized, of course, it's an Etruscan site because it's absolutely classic. And nobody's ever excavated there because it's been discredited by Curzio's discoveries. But in fact, it's just bonehead obvious that there must be something Etruscan there. And so Curzio was 17 when he started faking these things, and they came let's see, he's born 1611, and they're coming out the 1630s.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So mid 17th century then.
It's mid 17th century. It's actually, he finds them in 1634, and then he starts, that's right. No, see, he's born later than 1611. That's one of his relatives. But what happens, it comes out right after Galileo's been condemned by the Inquisition down in Rome. And the argument about the authenticity of these forgeries is taken up by the same people who are defending Galileo. And he actually has the person who's the protagonist of his forged texts talking about astronomy, proving that everybody who lives in Tuscany, like Galileo, was already preternaturally gifted with astronomical insight.
Oh, wow.
So it was taking the cutting edge sort of scientific issues of its day and mangling them.
Yeah, and so I thought he was doing this seriously until I got to the archive in Volterra, and there were 2 comedies that he'd written. I thought these are going to be really awful. And as usual, I underestimated him, and I started reading these things, and they're screamingly funny, even hundreds of years later.
Oh, wow.
And then I started looking back at this whole enterprise of his, and I think it's basically a colossal parody of Etruscan forgeries, because there was already a long history in Italy of forged Etruscan texts.
Now, this is happening... Oh, I'm sorry.
This is in the 17th century, but the first big forgery to emerge is in 1498.
Oh, wow.
And those are printed, and they're terribly influential. And what he does is a sustained parody of this book of 1498 that was a great sensation when it came out, and revealed all sorts of amazing things about the Etruscans and about Rome.
Do any of the, so for our listeners, if I understand correctly, you've got the Etruscans as kind of like a people, as a political force, and then the Romans, very much, who had been ruled by them, by their own telling, very much make a big part of their identity that they had broken free, and rather than being ruled by kings, they were going to be a republic until the 1st century BC. So that's kind of the sort of the role of the Etruscans in the Italian imagination.
It was for the Romans, and anybody who identified for the Romans. And so this whole thing about kicking out the kings in 509 and then setting up the Republic. But the Tuscans, on the other hand,
right,
in the Renaissance, start looking back at this, and there's an exchange of letters between Poggio Bracciolini, who's one of the city councilmen in Florence, writing to Lorenzo Valla in the Vatican, and this is the early 1400s.
So what that reminds me of is something I've talked about on the show a little, what I call this notion of kind of collapsed proto-history, how the things that are on the very edge of history, often the first historically documented people, but usually not documented by themselves, documented by other people, end up being really important for creating identity. So like Celts or Incas or Aztecs, or there's a whole bunch of different ones where they end up becoming, because they have one foot in kind of like mythic prehistory and one foot in historical. And it sounds like that's very much what the Etruscans are being used for here. That one, of course, they're in Tuscany, so it makes perfect sense the Tuscans would do that. But secondly, they're in essence at the edge of history. Is that about right?
Yeah, and so they don't talk back in a way that they can argue with you, whereas the Romans could. You've got enough Roman texts that they can argue back. And so because we have all these Etruscan inscriptions, but all they tell you about are family relationships, then there's this vast field of imagination.
You can shape them into whatever you want.
Yeah, and they won't protest. And especially because it looks very much as if starting in the 1st century BC, after Julius Caesar, when there's the big fight between the future Augustus and Mark Antony about who's going to take over, Antony has the Etruscans on his side.
Oh.
And so there's a real suppression of them under Augustus.
Yeah, it doesn't go well for them, I take it.
No, and you stop seeing Etruscan inscriptions right after Augustus gets in. There's some fascinating poems by Propertius, who's from Assisi and saw all of these Etruscan wars. And he's asked by the cultural czar of Augustus, Maecenas, who is himself an Etruscan, why don't you write for us? And Propertius says, oh no, my girlfriend's eyes are my only inspiration. And then he said, but if I were going to write, I wouldn't write about Troy. I'd write about how you overturned the altars of the Etruscans. And he just starts talking blood and guts and all the terrible things that Augustus has done. And that's the end of Propertius writing for Augustus for another 1.5 books. And then finally, the 4th book of poetry, he's decided to go over to the dominant side. But there's a resistance aspect to the Etruscans, especially for the emerging Tuscan republics in the Middle Ages and then going into the Renaissance, where they see Rome as the oppressor.
Right.
I was half thinking you were going to say the book was finished by somebody in a very different handwriting. It says, and now Rome is good, signed Etruscan poet.
Yeah.
Signed Etruscan poet.
So in the 17th century, there's this kind of simmering resentment in Tuscany about what happened in the past, about Rome, and this yearning for their mythic past.
And there's the mythic past, plus you have the Roman Inquisition silencing Galileo, who's under house arrest in Florence. And so the Etruscans become an excuse by which the Grand Duchy of Tuscany can beat back at Rome and send up the Pope.
Well, let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, maybe we can look a little bit more into what these Scariths said exactly.
Exactly. What are the themes?
I mean, we got the backdrop. Now let's look at the real deal, so to speak.
What makes for a great vacation? Depends on who you ask. Are you looking to get away or bring everyone together? Do you want to get outside and play or see a play at the plate? Fortunately, however you operate, I'm the destination you've been looking for. The name's Missouri, but you can call me Mo. And I have just one question. What's your MO? Come see me at visitmo.com.
Stay cool and choose from over 40 in-stock ceiling fans for under $100, plus an 11% rebate at Menards. We carry the largest selection of in-stock Hunter ceiling fans, available in a variety of designs, finishes, and features. Create the perfect look and lighting for any room with a new Hunter ceiling fan. Visit Menards.com and view our entire selection of Hunter ceiling fans, plus the weekly flyer and other great deals going on now.
Save big money at Menards.
Hey everyone, and we are back, and we are still talking with Ingrid Rowland. And so tell us, we know the Scariths are A, a made-up word, and B, some kind of capsule with writing inside of them, but what were these things that he was writing about and putting inside these Scariths?
It turns out that they're all supposed to be written by a young man named Prospero of Fiesole, who's a student priest at the priest school of Volterra. And it's 63 BC. It's right after Cicero has unmasked an assassination attempt by his rival as consul, Lucius Sergius Catilina. And Catilina has come up and tried to get Etruscan allies so that he can attack Rome. And instead what's happened is Cicero's unleashed the Roman army, and the Roman army's coming to attack the citadel of Volterra. And at this point, student Prospero writes that he's consigning to these permanent capsules all the treasures of his heritage and his dear household gods and some of his family treasures, and he's been pressed into service to defend the citadel of Scornello against the encroaching Roman troops.
So the barbarians are at the gates.
The barbarians are at the gates, and the barbarians are the Roman army under Cicero.
Right.
Well, that's actually pretty damn dramatic. I have one question before we get further on that. How common would a name like Prospero have been, since me being Anglo-centric or Anglo-speaking would immediately go to The Tempest?
Right, I think so too.
Yeah, so would that have been an unusual name either in, I assume, I'm not even worried about in the Etruscan times because, I mean, but even in the 16th century or the 17th century, is that an unusual name?
It's unusual, and I wouldn't totally rule out the Shakespeare connection.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay, that's kind of cool, actually.
Yeah.
This is about the same time Milton is studying in Florence, and one of Milton's friends in Florence gets involved in this whole controversy.
Oh, really?
Huh.
Interesting.
And so this Curzio is living in a remote villa outside Volterra, which is remote from Florence. And so I think he's spending a lot of time as a young man with his father's library, which is unfortunately dispersed now, but I wouldn't put it past him to read all kinds of things.
Huh.
And so what Prospero's setting out is the whole history of Etruria from the Etruscan point of view. And because Etruscan, the texts, as he says, are written both in Etruscan and in Latin because otherwise they won't be readable.
Right. Right.
This is the Rosetta Stone only 150 years before the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, if you're gonna fake ancient knowledge, you have to go one of two ways. Either you have to do that where you have some mystical, and this actually brings up something I'm going to ask in a minute, some mystical language, etc., but you've got it translated, or you go like the James Churchward or the Helena Blavatsky route, like I'm the only one who can read these glyphs,
Right.
so you have to listen to me.
Or you need the magic glasses.
Right, exactly. That's a variant on that. I did want to ask, you said this is in the mid-17th century, and I've done a little bit of reading on how hieroglyphs were seen at this time, where you've got, I think it's Hierapolis Hieroglyphica, which reappears, and this is kind of like the height, and near the end of the century with Kircher, I don't mispronounce his name, Athenaeus Kircher, looking at ancient hieroglyphs, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, as being almost quasi-mystical. But this is in Etruscan alphabetic, so this is seen as just writing. It doesn't really have that same kind of sort of patina of the mystical about it.
It does to a certain extent in Tuscany because it's all religious. And in fact, what happens is that Curzio's father's very ambitious for him. And so he starts presenting these things to learned societies in Tuscany. And then the texts are published in a book, and the book is sent right down to Athanasius Kircher. And they say, well, you already know 23 languages. How's this Etruscan?
Right.
And
what did he respond?
He won't say anything because he's waiting for the Grand Duke of Tuscany to give him an Arabic font so that he can print with really high quality Arabic instead of the stuff he's been using from the College of the Propaganda Fide. So he holds off until 1650 and says nothing about it. And meanwhile, there are fights that erupt in all these learned societies, but everybody agrees that Curzio Ingirami showing off his Scarith is the best show in town. And everybody personally likes him a great deal and finds him amazingly erudite and witty. And
so you're saying he was a TED Talk, is what you're saying?
Yeah, he's basically a walking TED Talk. There's one portrait of him. He's quite chubby in a way that's run through the family because the family still exists. I've become friends with his descendants.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And the sense of humor also seems to be part of the family because there's a famous forebear who worked at the time of Raphael and Julius II, who's also hilarious and also on the roly-poly side. And so you have this amusing guy doing something completely different.
Now, is this the gentleman that is the possible forger?
And it turns out that fairly quickly people start deciding that he's the forger.
Gotcha. Okay. Do we know if he's the forger?
The handwriting of the Scarith, his handwriting are identical.
Ah, all right.
It's
Well,
just, again, if you're going to try to pull off an authentic looking archaeological hoax, and we've seen that before on this podcast, it doesn't have to be authentic for people to believe it.
True.
You want to change your handwriting, for God's sake.
Well, I guess that asks another question, though. I mean, are we dealing in the 17th century in this particular cultural context with a different concept of authenticity? Or is it pretty much, no, this is bullshit?
Yeah, but it's really an interesting moment because this is where a lot of criteria for authenticity get discussed. And it's precisely this incident that allows antiquarians in Italy in the early 17th century to figure out what their criteria are. So one of the things that everybody says is they didn't have paper back then. They wrote on linen. They didn't have the Zagreb mummy wrap as a proof. And so what they're doing is arguing back and forth on the basis of ancient literary testimony, whether cloth books were rag paper or were they real cloth. And now we know that it was real cloth. And as of the 18th century, we know that he was using paper from the local paper factory.
So the main kind of tests were largely, what did people say about the ancient Etruscans in written texts? Like, that was what you would test it against.
Yeah, you test it against that. And so this is the very beginning when you start systematically testing it against archaeological artifacts, which would be common a century later, but this is the beginning. And then the whole argument about paper, about whether the Etruscans write right to left or left to right. And so it's a crucial moment really in establishing the criteria for authenticity. And then meanwhile, I'd come across his plays, and then there's part of his own diary in which he writes, and he says, my whole problem is I really wanted to be a historian, but I'm not well educated enough. And Dad wants me to go to law school, but I really don't want to go to law school. And then I found the Scarith, and I didn't have to go to law school.
Nice.
So we have motive means opportunity. They have to be just good enough to get him from having to go to Florence to go to law school.
So was he producing these things? I mean, he did them for a long while, right?
Yeah, he certainly produced 5 or 6 of them that are illustrated in the book. And then as people criticize him, he keeps having to forge Scarith that prove that the criticisms aren't true.
And how many of these did he find altogether?
So apparently there were never more than a handful that anybody saw physically. And then he refers to about 50 of them, but they may be made up. And then he branches out and he starts forging documents in the local archives from the Middle Ages.
Oh.
And he's then picked up by the Bollandists who are writing an international compendium of saints' lives, and he becomes the expert on local Volterran saints, which include the second Pope Linus. And so he starts forging documents to put in the archives for the saints' lives.
Nice.
Oh my God.
Now you said that these were, and I have two. One, I read Ken's review, and they were referred to as time capsules, and I think apparently they were bitumen and wax and other materials. Like, the idea was that they had been purposely put away as for the future. Like, as you said, the city is about to fall. The Uruk-hai are on the gates. I must write down this last thing, and then arg at the end, like in the Black Books of Arg, when it overtakes. So one, there was the concept that somebody would do that. And secondly, do you think that it was important that they were dug up, rather than being found in an archive or just appearing, that there was the idea of them being excavated?
Yeah, that was crucial. And at Scornello, you can see there are these precipitous slopes. So they keep talking about how these capsules were pulled from beneath bunches of roots. And in fact, in the road cut around the villa, which is the same villa that he was in, you can see or the slopes are such that you can stick something under a root and still have it really close to the surface. Eventually,
Shades of Kensington.
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Oh, yeah.
and the first testimony we have is one of his servants, because he and his sister were going on a fishing expedition. And the servant says they were bent over a dirty bundle laughing. And so I think Lucrezia Ingirami must have been intimately involved in this. And the Scarith, the early ones were wrapped in hair as well as pitch and bitumen and everything else. And I suspect Lucrezia was the source of the hair.
Oh my.
But nobody else, he didn't plant these and then other people found any of them. He found all of them?
He found the first ones, and then the police were sent down. And remarkably, each policeman got his own capsule.
Oh, nice.
The policemen were completely converted because each one of them had the joy of pulling a scarith from the earth with his own hands.
Wow, this guy, he knew how to do this, didn't he?
He was really remarkably shrewd.
Yeah, the best way to get somebody on your side is to give them the exact thing they want, and that sense of discovery is a great way.
Like we had when we had April Bisa on, the whole concept of if you take part, you're part of it.
Exactly.
Right. And smart enough that he actually put these things at a genuine Etruscan site.
Yeah, he really had this thought out, except for the whole watermark thing and
and the handwriting thing.
Yeah, whatever.
But now, and also, Ingrid, isn't there also this issue of that there's an order to which they were found that reflects the order of the story that Prospero actually tells?
Oh, that's funny.
Yes. And so that way he could keep elaborating on the story and then just make another text that will back him up.
It's just, it's incredible. Well, didn't anybody wonder a little bit skeptically about how it happened that they were found in the correct order?
Yeah, everybody gets really skeptical, but everybody in Tuscany, or there's one professor at the University of Pisa who's not a Tuscan, he's from the Swiss canton of Ticino, and he says these are totally bogus. They didn't write on paper, they wrote on linen, and the Grand Duke says, "Do you like your job?"
Well, of course.
So there's an element of, this is like the Bosnian pyramid. This is like so many of the things we've talked about where at the end of the day,
nationalism.
Some people just don't really care.
Yeah, and in this case, it's all about Galileo. So what I liked about the problem once I got into it is the fact that there's such a hagiography of Galileo. So he's right. He's the first scientist. Everybody else is crazy. And so all of his backers in this case are wrong. And the benighted Inquisition, which was benighted, but his most vicious Jesuit opponent is one of the people who gets involved in this whole controversy. And so it shows that the intrigues happening on both sides and the degree to which intellectual debates in that period were politically driven.
So are you saying that he managed to win over, or at least kind of trap his most ardent critic into thinking that these things were also real?
I think they know that they aren't real, but
they can't come out and say they're not?
Yeah, and they'd like to bludgeon the condemners of Galileo with the whole controversy. So it allows you to argue with Rome about Galileo without ever bringing up Galileo, because that gets you in real trouble. So if you argue about these, then you could vent your aggressions and not be excommunicated.
Was there any opportunity for skeptical scholars, not necessarily deniers, but skeptics, to actually personally examine any of these scrolls?
Yeah, there was a famous debate in Volterra between Leone Alaci, who is Vatican librarian, and he wrote the definitive debunking of the Scarith. It's published in 1540. And so he comes up and does a debate in Volterra, but they have such a good time in each other's company. I think Curzio knows they're fake, and Alaci knows they're fake. So then the whole idea is that you have this debate, and then everybody probably enjoyed the banquet afterwards, exceeding.
That's just very interesting.
So, but it's like, as Jeb said, the authenticity is a secondary and maybe even irrelevant issue.
Yeah.
This is interesting, and it tells us a story we want to hear, and so that's all we need to know.
Well, and I think that it's interesting that they were using this as a way to talk about Galileo and the politics of the day without actually having to mention any of those words. It really became, like, for lack of a better term, it became a dog whistle of the time. And I think that's fascinating that everybody's just like, yeah, this is how we're going to talk about this. It's like the agreed upon vocabulary to discuss other issues. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's what fascinates me about that period, that you have to be so careful about expressing ideas. And this is one way that you can get around it, is just to project everything into some almost fanciful controversy.
Now, if you're back in Rome at this time, is there a sense that the consensus is, oh, those silly Etruscans, what won't they believe?
In that case, they tend to really they zoom in on Curzio himself. And so it tends to be at first personal invective, and then finally there's a round of anonymous pamphlets. So that somebody from the Gentleman's Academy that hosted the great debate with the Vatican librarian and Curzio, and a member of that academy writes in and says, really, I don't see why everybody was being so mean to Curzio. Probably this was Curzio. It turns out that the club books for the years in which he's a member have disappeared.
Aww.
I'm sure someplace. I haven't found them yet. And then down in Rome, Galileo's Jesuit opponent and this Vatican librarian write what's supposed to be a dialogue by a guy named Benno Dirkendurk, who's sort of a dumb Austrian. He said, oh, I heard about this, but I don't know too much, but it seems to me this is really bogus.
Did they seriously name him Dirkendurk?
Yeah, it's Benno Dirkendurk, and it turns out, this is going back to the Ingirami family trees. The Ingirami are actually German extraction. They came with Emperor Otto I in the 9th century.
Oh, wow.
And their ancestors named Benno. So this is a takeoff. And what Curzio does when he publishes his Scarith texts is show his whole family tree to give a pedigree to his erudition. And so what these guys in the Vatican are doing are making fun of it. And they've got all the resources of the Vatican Library, plus they have Father Kircher with his linguistic gift. And so it's obvious to everybody in Rome that these texts are completely absurd, and what they're missing at first, and I think they probably cotton onto when there's the debate up in Volterra, is that he's having fun with it. It is sustained parody.
Well, let's take a break real quick, and when we come back, we will kind of wrap up this story, because it is a very fascinating story.
Fascinating, yeah.
8-Bit Test Pit is here to put Archaeogaming on the map. Hosted by key players of the Archaeogaming world, 8-Bit Test Pit sets to explain the weird and wonderful connections between the study of our past and the virtual worlds we like to explore. 8-Bit Test Pit breaks the field of archaeogaming down into 3 accessible formats. The main campaign is the monthly show featuring a panel discussion led by Andrew Reinhardt, Megan Dennis, and Tara Copplestone on a number of issues and topics, all of which revolve around the intersection of archaeology and gaming. Everything from coding practices to ethics in and about the game reality. Dug Up content is bite-sized 15-minute episodes released every 6 weeks, filled to the brim with information covering key terms and concepts in and about the field of archaeogaming. These will inform and educate in the time it takes to load your saved game. Archeo Deathmatch. 2 archaeogamers enter, 1 archaeogamer leaves. When a field is new, disagreements are going to happen. Here in the virtual arena, 2 archaeologists debate a topic related to archaeogaming, hosted every 5 weeks, or as needed. Archaeogaming covers not only the study of archaeology in video games, but also the study of games as material culture. Some of our hosts you already may know. Andrew Reinhardt, who was featured in the documentary Atari Game Over, Tara Copplestone, who studies how games are made through an archaeological lens, and Megan Dennis, a PhD candidate at the University of York who is studying ethics in video games. Plus, many more interested and insightful players in the archaeogaming world are ready to load. The show is hosted and produced by Sarah Head of Archeo Fantasies fame and Tristan Boyle, content creator of the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Save big money on pressure-treated lumber for your outdoor project at Menards. Menards has the best in-stock selection of AC2 pressure-treated lumber, decking, and fencing. All easy to load in our drive-through lumber yard. Choose from our huge inventory and build your project to last. Plus, you can get free estimates fast with our fence and deck design programs in-store or online at menards.com.
Save big money at Menards.
And we are back, and we are still talking with Ingrid Rowland. And so when we finished right before last break, you were telling us how the Vatican and such were writing pamphlets that were written by a made-up person named Dirk, and that the gentleman who was forging the Scariths, he also was publishing his own anonymous pamphlets about these Scariths. So basically, they're having this argument anonymously through these leaflets? Is that what's happening?
And so they have it first in person, and they have it in other characters based on themselves.
So this fake artifact is a fun argument that the societies at the time are enjoying, but then they start creating fake people to continue this argument about a fake artifact. Is that what's happening?
That's what's happening.
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
This Jesuit who's writing from Rome ultimately wrote under 8 pseudonyms, one of which was Lucius Cornelius the European, and he writes a satire of his own Jesuit order, which means that he gets in big trouble in 1648.
Oh, wow.
When you have so many pseudonyms, how do you keep them straight? No, wait a minute. Who am I supposed to be now? So it's the 17th century. Does Cusio in any way, does he make these things available? Can you go to a museum in 1640 and look as a lay person actually look at the Scarith, or are these locked away?
They're probably in his palazzo, but one of his comedies has an old geezer who's coming to Voltaire. I'm coming up with Scarith, because he made up this word. And then there's an Italian version of the word that's used in his native town, so that even today, everybody knows about gli Scariti. And the plays are in Italian, so this man's, I'm going to go see the Scariti. So I guess you could just knock on the door and say, I'd like to see the Scariti. And if I'd been onto this in 1975, I probably could have seen the Scariti.
Oh, right, before they disappear.
Oh, dear. Yeah, that's right.
So now, So Curzio, how long does he live? So he's doing this all. He begins this when he's a teenager.
Yeah, he began it in his teens. He only lived to be 44 years old. But in that time, he'd managed to marry the woman he loved, who was a widow in Volterra. And so he managed to live the life that he wanted rather than life that his dad wanted for him. He became the eccentric local antiquarian.
And there was never any confession, either subtle or overt, that, hey, you know what, guys, I made all this up.
No.
Are there any cases like this remotely in time that might give us a suggestion of what would happen if there had been? I mean, anything we could even think of as an analog to this for a comparison?
If he had confessed to it?
Or had been caught, or, yeah.
Yeah, he basically was caught. It's just that nobody wanted to prosecute him. So I think everybody knew they were fake.
Yeah.
And there's a similar case in this case of 1498 where the forger ends up becoming the chief theologian in the Vatican, is the number three person in the Dominican order worldwide.
I'm not even sure what exactly I want to say to that.
I was going to say, so the lesson here is in that time, if you forged things, you got to live a good life.
If you forged things that people liked.
That's true.
They
That's true. Yeah, because there was the guy that got in trouble for his, so.
Yeah, you have facts. They are possibly alternative, and nothing bad goes wrong.
Jeb.
The more things change,
the more they stay the same. Yeah, no, I was going to make an analogy to the Bosnian pyramids in that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many people really believe those are real, but there's a lot of invested interest in at least selling the story that they are real.
Well, we have a chapter in our volume Lost City Found Pyramid about that, and there are clear people in Bosnia who believe they're real. A lot of people, it sounds like this. It sounds like that they know that they're okay with it for other reasons, though not the playfulness that we're hearing here. But I'll say this, I mean, once you get into like the communities that we talk about, they're really popular. Like, you know, there are podcasts to listen to where they'll just constantly refer to them as one key linchpin in a larger lost civilization narrative.
Well, and there's the next logical step from the conversation. How are the Scariths received today? Like, in modern era, are they still seen as being these basically playful forgeries, or is there a following that believes that these are authentic and that they unravel a deeper secret?
Yeah, I think the last person to believe in them was Cotton Mather.
Really?
Oh, that's a good place to start.
Yes.
How?
For our listeners, who exactly is Cotton Mather?
Cotton Mather is one of the most famous Puritan ministers in U.S. history, and he wrote a great commentary on the Bible that he started in the late 1600s and carried on through the rest of his life into the 1700s. But he cites Curzio Ingirami in saying that Noah is an ancestor of the Etruscans.
Because why not? Why not?
Yes.
And this is also the same Cotton Mather that, if I remember my murdering people who are accused of witchcraft in New England right, was involved in murdering people that were accused of witchcraft in Salem and other places.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he's writing about spectral evidence in the Salem witch trials being admissible when his father Increase is completely against it.
That seems entirely appropriate that he would also just take, because why not?
And Ingrid, aren't there in what Prospero is writing, aren't there kind of inklings of Christianity long before the birth of Christ? Are there things that Catholics reading that would say, wow, we recognize that?
And that was because the Gregorian calendar had just come in 1583. So we're not that far into the Gregorian calendar, and people are obsessed with chronology. So that when Prospero says, I've heard about the great king from whom the years will be numbered. That just got all the chronologists
Well, yeah, of course.
excited.
Wow.
And the fact that he dated everything, so we know this is all happening in 63 BC. It's very
which is like psychic, right?
Well, this is a very common pattern. You see this in a lot of the Atlantean writers and the Lost Continent writers that follow Donnelly, where they're talking about they on the one hand, so the Blavatsky and Theosophists, they really kind of sort of want to be in places vaguely Hindu, vaguely this, but a lot of the people that follow in there or work with them seem to be injecting a whole lot of kind of lay Christianity or vague versions of it, and so it's always amazing how 10,000 BC, it's going to be certain that the one piece of the Lost Continent of Mu's evidence is going to get to Moses, because and this sounds very familiar.
Well, and it's interesting that narrative survives. It's not interesting. I personally think it's kind of sad how this narrative survives today, because I'm reading this book, and that is honestly the underlying drive of this book is proving that North America, ancient, prehistoric, pre-contact North America, was a Christian continent before Europeans ever got over here. Like, that is the driving narrative of this book. And so it's still a very modern goal to basically Christianize the past.
Yeah, and because Noah was the first Etruscan, the Etruscan past is well and truly Christianized.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Ingrid, when was I would think that the watermark on paper would be the smoking gun, right?
I love this watermark thing.
When was that revealed? Was that after Curzio died or before?
Yeah, it's about 50 years after he dies.
Okay, all right.
Well, that's good, because that makes that a little harder to ignore if it was found while he was alive. But yeah, after he's dead, I guess that kind of was the nail in the coffin of this whole fraud.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
if I'm right, they already knew that this was a fake.
Well, yeah.
So this was just, of course.
Yeah, and by that time it's ridiculed. And so in a way, what I was trying to do is restore to him some dignity as a creative artist.
Well, it is an interesting kind of performance art, right? Producing these capsules, putting them in the ground, discovering them, revealing them, and then reveling in all the attention that you get
and presenting them. I think that's a major part of it that you're pointing out. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, just think of the entertainment industry he built around these too, because not only is he showing these off, but then he and a couple of his rivals are arguing with each other back and forth with fictitious names. I mean, it's like television.
Well, as I say, it's halfway between the History Channel, and I can imagine this guy with like a, Scarif's meme, and on the other half, it's almost like people role playing.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It kind of is, where it's like they've come up with these characters and they know it's not real, but they kind of sort of get into it, and it's showy for. In fact, it's like those people that do the role playing on YouTube for people.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. It would be interesting to me, and I'll have to pick up your book and read it, because I would like to see if the arguments between the rivals going back and forth, if that didn't itself help build the backstory and the history and just the world that these Scariths would have had to have existed in, just to kind of see if they were writing their own narrative while they were arguing back and forth.
Well, controversy and argument is part of the publicity machine today, and apparently in the past, to get things out in front of the public and get people interested. It's more interesting if people are yelling at one another about something than if not.
True.
So, now you say that. So you still have descendants today. How do they fit into the conversation? Do they like talking about this? Are they embarrassed by what their ancestor did? Do they find it whimsical? How do they view the descendants of Curzio Ingarami? How do they view this whole story?
Yeah, they wish I'd work on Admiral Jacopo, who's more respectable.
Oh, okay.
And that I was actually inducted into the same academy that Curzio was in, but I'm there for, as they said, having written a historical ironic novel.
Awesome.
That's funny. I mean, were descendants more than happy to talk? Did you speak to his descendants when you were writing the book? Were they happy to talk to you? Did they close the door in your faces and say, "Go away, we don't like talking about this"?
No, they were amazingly hospitable, so
great.
I really had a good time with them.
And as you say, I think you pointed out to me that there is a family website that in Italian that talks about this issue and in fact mentions your book.
Yeah, there's a lot about that. And then Jacopo, who's my age, also has something about the virtues of the Tuscan cigar. And so he's all over the place. He's a professor of computer science at the Bocconi University in Milan. So he's first rate in his field.
Is that
Well,
right?
That's kind of poetic. I mean, all the guy wanted was to be an academic, and now down the line, his children have become well-respected academics.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's kind of sweet. This is a really fun and
Fascinating
interesting
story, yeah.
artifact that for us. Usually we're kind of trying to unravel motives, and it's not nearly as light-hearted of a fraud. It's usually got some kind of money motive or just in general, trying to prove things that aren't necessarily true. This sounds like it almost sounds like he made these on purpose just so that maybe people could talk about politics and the whole Galileo thing.
Like, oh no, he's artfully defending Galileo from anti-science. How horrible.
Exactly. I feel like that this was actually done for the right reason, if you can say that about a fraud.
Yeah, and it has a happy ending.
Well,
Right?
yeah.
Yes. And one of the happy endings is the book that Ingrid wrote, Scarith of Scornello. And again, I highly recommend, folks, go get yourself a copy of the book. It is a really interesting story, and it's funny and insightful, and I enjoyed it very much. And I recommend go get yourself a copy.
So, Ingrid, do you have any final thoughts on your story that you've been telling us, this fascinating story? Anything we didn't highlight through our questions that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think it's really just the funniness of it that you can't get from if you don't read the texts, because they're done in this mock solemnity, so that he's really sending up every kind of serious academic publication.
That's funny. Ken, final thoughts?
Well, I mean, again, it's a great book. Get yourself a copy of the book. And I think it's this really interesting. The thing that I find most interesting are these commonalities that there are differences, but when you look at when we had Brad Lepper and Jeff Gill talking about the Newark Holy Stones and why people embrace that, and the Los Salinas Decalogue and the Kensington Runestone, the ethnic connections, the historical connections, the yearning for this mythic past. I've actually had people who've told me, if you listen, you're an archaeologist, you really can't ever know anything in archaeology. So the job of the archaeologist should be to provide a mythic past that makes people today feel better about themselves. And that's a horrible thing for an archaeologist to hear. But understand, there is this thread. People, what we should be doing is making people feel better. And Curzio apparently made Tuscans feel better. And, in a humorous way.
And I think we've talked about this, that honestly, as brutally offensive and ignorant as that is, and I'm not saying that to be funny, it is actually brutally offensive and ignorant. It also does capture why people actually do archaeology, I think. I mean, it's about, what do these things do? Well, they explain why the present makes sense in light of the past.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking at the past not to make point, what are you doing if it's not to make sense of the present?
Right.
I mean, what's the point of what you're doing other than like obsessive collection of bottle caps?
Saving for the inevitable fallout?
Well, I do know what you're talking about, but I wasn't quite going there.
Well, Ingrid, thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. This was a wonderful podcast. Really enjoyed it.
Me too.
Yes, Ingrid,
Yes.
What a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Yes, thank you.
Raise your trials as one will call. No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. Our music was provided by Archaeosuit Productions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Stitcher and share us wherever you use social media. You can contact us with your questions, comments, or angry email at archifantasies@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archifantasies. You can follow the blog at www.archifantasies.com and get updates on Tumblr and Twitter at Archaeofantasies. You can also look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes for this episode, go to the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeofantasies. Thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle and edited by Chris Sims.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. To serve others in ways that promote human flourishing and create a ripple effect of transformation for generations to come. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Save big money on pressure-treated lumber for your outdoor project at Menards. Menards has the best in-stock selection of AC2 pressure-treated lumber, decking, and fencing. All easy to load in our drive-through lumber yard. Choose from our huge inventory and build your project to last. Plus, you can get free estimates fast with our fence and deck design programs in-store or online at menards.com.
Save